Season 2, Episode 4, The Weight He Carries. Chapter 1. The morning had the kind of light you get in Ashford in May when the sky hasn't made up its mind about rain. And I was driving south with a cup of station coffee in the holder, and the windows cracked because Eddie liked the air moving, even though he didn't technically need it to. Eddie was in the passenger seat, solidity holding the way it had been holding for the last week or so. The bracelet on my left wrist was warm against my pulse the way it always was now. 3 weeks in and counting. Sabo had called at 7:15 with the kind of case she passed along when her own plate was full and she wanted a clean pair of hands. A family arrangement, she'd said. A woman in Ashford County wanted a reputational cost lifted off her, and her cousin had agreed to take it on. And the cousin needed a practitioner who wouldn't make a production of it. The paperwork was in my email by the time I'd finished the coffee. It read clean. Helena Marsh, 54, a career setback from 5 years back settling on her like a slow weather system. And a cousin named Tamar who'd volunteered to carry it. Family arrangements ran through my practice 3 or 4 times a year. I had a rhythm for them. Eddie had watched me read the paperwork over my second cup and had said only that I should be careful. The way he said most things that morning, without specifying what about. I'd told him I was always careful. He'd given me the look that wasn't quite a look, and we'd gone down to the car. The drive south took us through the industrial corridor and past the old foundry lots where the grass had started coming back after a long season of nothing. And I was thinking about Tamar without really thinking about her. Running through the paperwork in the back of my attention the way I always did before a reading. At a red light on Ferris, I glanced over at Eddie. He was looking out the window the way he did when he was looking and thinking about something else. The morning sun was coming in at an angle from the east, and it caught on the fold of his jacket where the collar turned. And the fold held the light for a second the way cloth holds light. Not the way nothing holds light. I put the Taurus in gear when the light turned green and kept my eyes on the road. Eddie, after a while, said that he hadn't been to the South Corridor since before. He meant before he died. It was the kind of thing he was saying more often now, casually, in passing. The way a person mentions a city they used to live in when they're driving past a sign for it on the highway. I asked if he remembered anything about it, and he said not really. Just that the light was the same, which meant something to him even if he couldn't say what. I let him sit with that. The address Sabo had sent was a rented space in a commercial strip on Raleigh, between a tax preparer and a Pilates studio. In a building that had been a savings and loan sometime in the 70s and had never fully recovered from the economics of no longer being one. I pulled into the lot and found a space 3 down from the door. The sign in the Pilates window had plants in it, and the tax preparer's window had a sign that said, "We handle offers in compromise," in letters that had faded on one side more than the other. I cut the engine and sat for a moment before getting out. Eddie was already looking at the door of the rented space, or the direction of it, as if he could see something about it from here that I couldn't. "Let's go do the work," I said. Eddie said nothing, and I got out of the Taurus, and he came with me across the lot to the door. Chapter 2. The Reading. The rented space was the kind of room that doesn't have an opinion about what happens in it. 2 chairs, a table, a water dispenser that hummed on a bad fluorescent cycle, carpet worn in front of the door from people arriving and leaving at all hours of whatever day the room had been rented for. Tamar was already in one of the chairs when I came in, with a thermos on the table in front of her and a folder beside it. And she looked up and stood when I came through the door the way a person stands when they've been through the process before and know the first thing that happens is a handshake. She was in her late 30s. Dark hair pulled back. Dressed in the kind of deliberately plain clothes that said she owned clothes that were not this plain and had chosen these ones on purpose. We shook hands, and hers was cool and steady. I introduced myself, and she said her name was Tamar and thanked me for coming. And we sat down across the table from each other. She had a cup of coffee in front of her from the thermos that was the one personal thing on the table. She didn't offer me any, and I didn't ask. I walked her through my process. I would do the reading in stages, starting from the middle distance and working closer, confirming what she carried and whether the new placement would fit before we went any further. If anything was off, I'd stop and we'd talk, and at any point she could ask me to stop. She said she understood and that she'd been through the process before with cousin Helena once or twice, for smaller family matters. I noted that without reacting, and the paperwork had described this as a one-time arrangement. Her saying otherwise was the kind of small mismatch I would come back to if the reading gave me reason to come back to it. I asked if she was ready, and she said she was. She stood up and filled a paper cup from the water dispenser in the corner and set it in front of me before I could tell her she didn't need to. The cup was cold against my palm when I tested it. I set it on the table between us and put my hands flat beside it. And for a moment, the only sound in the room was the fluorescent hum from the ceiling, which I hadn't been hearing until now. I opened the reading. I reached my attention across the short distance between us without touching her yet, letting it settle into the quiet field that surrounds anyone living. Tamar's was clean in the way water is clean after it has been running through a filter for a long time. Nothing pressing, nothing leaking, nothing fresh, just between weights. I asked her to extend her hand. She put it flat on the table between us, palm up, and I rested mine on top of hers without closing my fingers. Her pulse was steady under my thumb. Touch gets you closer to the precise thing, and this was the kind of reading where I wanted to be close. What I felt under my hand was not what the paperwork had described. I felt it in the first few seconds before I had even settled into the reading. Her body carried the particular quality an experienced bearer's body takes on after a long time in the work. Not damage exactly, but the kind of settling that happens when a person has taken on weight and cleared it and taken on more and cleared that over years. Multiple prior carries, all cleared, none raw, each of them visible as a trace, the way growth rings are visible inside a tree. 4, maybe 5 times she had done this over a span of years. Families do this once, if ever. Tamar had done it as a practice, and I had heard of this before. The way practitioners quietly warned each other about brokers who ran market work through paperwork that called itself family, routing the actual transactions through practitioners like me who would not take market work knowingly and who were chosen for the kind of clean reputation that meant we would not ask questions the paperwork didn't invite. I had never sat across from it on my own table before. I was sitting across from it now. Under that, and deeper, was something else. Her body was built to carry more than most. That happens sometimes. Some people come out of the factory with more room for weight than others. And when they do, the brokers find them early and use them often. I recognized what I was feeling under my palm because I had felt a version of it inside myself for as long as I had been doing this work. Though not the same version. Hers was smaller, and hers had a real edge I could feel, a point where, if she carried past it, her body would stop coming back from what it had been asked to hold. Mine didn't have an edge I had ever found. Otherwise, what we were was the same kind of thing. I kept that off my face. My breath had gone shallow. The reading had gone deeper than I'd planned. For the third pass, I worked my hand a little further in. That's not a movement of the fingers. The hand stays where it is. What moves is attention. You settle what you've been holding at the surface and let it sink through the grain of the person into the deeper structure. It is work your body does without visible effort. And when the reading has already opened things you didn't plan to open, the work gets harder. My chest felt tight. The fluorescent hum in the ceiling had sharpened into something I could hear individually separate from the room. I felt for the distance between what she was already carrying and the edge I had sensed. The distance was smaller than her posture suggested. She was living day to day, much closer to breaking than she knew. The cost Helena wanted moved would fit into the room she had for it. It would settle without taking her down today. But it would sit on top of what was already there, closer to that real edge than she believed she was. And the next job she took, the one after that, the one she'd accept in 6 months because the money would have worked out by then, would be the one that put her past where her body could recover from. I worked in a little further, and the shape of it arrived the way these things arrive, all at once rather than in pieces. Not an image, a sense. The specific tension of a bearer's body one step past what it could hold. The whole frame of it buckling inward. The work of a body trying to stay together around something that was no longer containable. I had never felt that particular sensation in a living person. I had heard about it from older practitioners who had worked too long and seen it too many times. It was not like other kinds of damage. It was the thing that waited at the edge, specific and patient. The bracelet on my wrist grew warmer during the third pass. Not by much, enough to feel alongside everything else. It was not the surge I would later feel in the parking lot, it was something quieter. A lift in the warmth that stayed with me while my hand stayed on hers, as if the bracelet were following the reading wherever the reading was going. I didn't know what the warmth was responding to. I wasn't in a position to ask that question yet. My own body was working, and the work needed my attention. I drew my hand back and closed the reading, and sat for a moment with my eyes still shut. My pulse was up, and the shallow breath was still shallow. I gave myself a count of 10 to come back up to the room before I opened my eyes. When I opened them, Tamar was waiting with the patience of a person who had been in rooms like this before and knew what the quiet after a reading meant. I reached for the cup of water she had poured me and drank half of it. The water was still cold, and the fluorescent hum was still there. My hand was a little unsteadier putting the cup back down than it had been picking it up. "I'm not going to do the placement today," I told her. She took that in without reacting, and she set her cup down and waited for me to say the rest. I told her plainly. The paperwork didn't match what I had read in her body. What I had read was multiple prior carries, which meant this wasn't a one-time family arrangement, which meant the paperwork was a fiction, and we both knew what kind of fiction it was. I told her her current carry was closer to breaking her than her posture suggested, and that the cost Helena Marsh wanted moved wouldn't take her down today but would set her up to be taken down by the next one, which she would accept because she had reasons to accept it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took a slow breath and set her hands flat on the table. "I appreciate the read, Mr. Vance," she said, "but I've been doing this for 6 years. I've learned what I can carry and what I can't. I calibrate my own limits every morning when I get up, and I've been wrong about them before, but not in a way that took me down. You read me for half an hour in a rented room. I read myself every day. One of those is going to be more accurate than the other." I didn't argue with her, and there was nothing to argue about. She was a grown woman who had been doing this work longer than most of the practitioners she worked with, and she wasn't asking me to decide whether she was capable of her own life. I thanked her for her time and told her I wouldn't be doing the work for her broker, and that she should understand another practitioner would likely take the job if she wanted it done. She said she understood that too. I stood and she stood, and we shook hands a second time, and I walked out of the rented space with Eddie beside me. Into the parking lot, into the afternoon. Chapter 3. The Parking Lot. The light in the lot had changed while I had been inside. It was past 3 in the afternoon now, and the sky had gone from morning indecision to a flat gray that suggested rain without committing to it, and the asphalt smelled like held rain. My hands were a little unsteady from the reading, and I was walking slower than usual. I was crossing the lot toward the Taurus when I bumped into a woman coming out of the Pilates studio. It was a small bump, the kind that happens in parking lots every day of the week. Her shoulder met mine at the point where our paths crossed. Neither of us was watching, and we both stopped and said sorry at the same time. She had a yoga mat over her shoulder and her phone in her hand, and she was about my age. Maybe a little younger. And she gave me the automatic smile of a person who didn't know me and wasn't planning to, and continued on toward her car. The bracelet on my wrist surged warm. I stopped walking. The woman with the yoga mat was getting into her car without a second glance at me. Eddie had stopped next to me and was looking at her, or at me, or at the space between us. The warmth at my wrist had changed shape. It wasn't hotter, it was heavier. I stood where I was in the middle of the lot with the keys already out of my pocket and looked at my left hand, which was the hand that had brushed her shoulder. The hand looked the same as it had a minute ago. I opened it and closed it once. It felt normal. The bracelet sat against the inside of my wrist where it always sat and did not look any different. But my body was off. I was holding my arm a little away from my side without planning to. My breathing had gone up a notch. When I took the next step toward the Taurus, I was aware of my feet landing on the asphalt in a way I was not normally aware of my feet landing on asphalt. The lot had not changed, but I had changed. Whatever had moved through the bump had moved through me on its way somewhere. I reached the Taurus and unlocked it and got in. The key was heavier than it should have been, or my hand was lighter, or both. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The bracelet was still warm in the new way, heavier, as if it were holding something it hadn't been holding before. I put my left hand on the steering wheel and felt the warmth against my wrist as a distinct thing, separate from the baseline. Eddie settled into the passenger seat beside me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. I kept my hand on the wheel and watched the woman with the yoga mat back her car out of its space and drive out onto Raleigh and turn north. She was carrying one less thing than she'd come in with, and she didn't know it. "When you bumped into her," Eddie said, "there was a glow." I turned my head toward him without moving my hand off the wheel. "Around your wrist?" he said. "It wasn't there a second before, and then it was, and then it went back to where it was. A glow, not bright, but clear enough to see." I looked at my wrist. The bracelet looked the same as it had every morning since it had attached at the dig site. There was no glow I could see. There was only the warmth I could feel, heavier than it had been, and the specific weight of something the bracelet was holding against my pulse that hadn't been there an hour ago. Eddie waited. I didn't know what to do with any of it, and I didn't pretend I did. I started the Taurus and let it idle for a while with my foot on the brake and my left hand back on the steering wheel. Not ready to drive yet. "I'm not going straight home," I said after a while. "I want to sit somewhere before I go home." Eddie didn't ask where. He knew the places I went when I wanted to sit somewhere. And there was one of them a couple of blocks further south on Raleigh. I put the Taurus in gear and pointed it that way. Chapter 4. The Diner. The diner on Raleigh was the kind of place with vinyl booths and a pot of coffee that had been sitting on a burner for a while, and a TV over the counter playing a baseball game that the two people at the counter weren't really watching. I took a booth by the window and the waitress came over, and I ordered coffee and nothing to eat. And she wrote nothing down because she was the kind of waitress who didn't write things down when the order was simple. The warmth at my wrist had not gone back to its baseline in the drive over. It was still heavier than it had been this morning. Still present in a way that I could feel as a distinct weight against my pulse. I put my left hand on the table with the bracelet facing up. Eddie was across from me in the booth, quiet since the parking lot. I saw Tamar when the waitress walked away. She was 3 booths down, on the same side of the room that I was on, facing the window the way I was facing the window. A plate of something in front of her she was not eating. A cup of coffee she was holding with both hands the way a person holds a cup, when the coffee isn't the point of holding it. She was looking at the window but not out of it. The reflection she could see was herself, and she had been sitting with that reflection for a while. She had aged. Not 10 years. More than 10. The dark hair she'd had pulled back in the rented room this afternoon had gray in it now, at the part and around the temples and in a streak through the bangs that had not been there 3 hours ago. The composed face she had met me with had thinned. The skin around her eyes had gone soft, not tired, something more permanent than tired. I'd seen it in mirrors after hard jobs. I saw it in Derek now. The mark a body wears when it's spent something it can't get back. She had gone back to the broker after I left her. The broker had found her another practitioner. And the other practitioner had done the work. And what I had told her would happen had happened. And it had taken what I had told her it would take. The waitress came by with the pot and I let her refill my cup without looking up. The coffee was too hot, and I didn't drink it. I put both hands around the mug the way Tamar was holding hers, 3 booths down. Not because I had anything in common with her, but because it was the only shape my hands seemed to want to be in right then. She stayed in the window. I watched her without watching her, keeping my eyes on the napkin dispenser when I needed a break, tracking her in my peripheral the way you track someone you don't want to make eye contact with in a room. Her shoulders had been held up when I left her in the rented space. Not tense, but set. The way a professional holds her shoulders. They weren't set now. They were holding her up the way a chair holds a person up, not posture, just function. The hair pulled back into its tie in the rented room was still pulled back into the same tie, but the tie was holding less than it had been this afternoon. Strands had come loose without being touched. Her mouth was slightly open. She was breathing through it in the way tired people breathe. The television over the counter was running an inning I wasn't following. One of the 2 people at the counter said something to the other one. They laughed, briefly, at whatever it was. The vinyl of the booth was sticky against the back of my arm where my sleeve had ridden up. Tamar lifted her cup and set it back down without drinking. Eddie had gone very still beside me. He watched her for a while before he spoke. "That's her," he said. "She looks different," I said. I didn't look away from her when I said it. He was quiet for another moment. "I've seen that before," he said. "Not her specifically. Somewhere, and I can't place it." I waited. He didn't say anything else. And I knew better than to press him when he was working at an edge of memory that hadn't finished forming. He would tell me when he could, or he wouldn't, and either was all right with me. I did not get up from my booth. I did not approach her. I'd told her what I'd seen, and she'd made the choice that was hers to make. Whatever I could say now wouldn't change what the day had cost her. So I sat where I was, and I watched her without staring. And when she was ready to leave, she paid her bill at the register without looking in my direction and walked out to the lot and got into an older sedan and drove away south. The waitress came by with the pot, and I covered my cup with my hand to let her know I was done. I paid for the first cup and left more on the table than the coffee had cost. Outside the diner, the sky had kept its threat of rain and not delivered on it. And the afternoon had gone fully over into the kind of gray evening that happens when the weather doesn't commit. Eddie and I walked back to the Taurus together. I got in and closed the door and sat for a moment before I started the engine, with my left wrist resting on the center console and the bracelet still warm from the parking lot. "I'll tell you if I remember," Eddie said. "All right," I said. I started the Taurus and pulled out of the diner lot and pointed us north toward home. The talk radio was still on from the morning, at the same volume I had set it at on the way south. And a different voice was reading the weather now, predicting that the rain would hold off through the night and come in sometime tomorrow around noon. I took Raleigh back up to the industrial corridor and turned onto the surface streets at Calvert because I wasn't ready to be on the highway yet. The city was quieting itself down toward evening. Businesses I had driven past this morning with their doors propped open had their doors closed now. A man was pulling the metal grate down over a laundromat on Calvert. The bodega on the corner had the lights on inside, but the awning lowered, which was what it looked like when the owner was about to close up. I hadn't thought about any of these details this morning. I was thinking about them now because my attention had nowhere else it needed to be. Eddie sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees. He didn't say anything for most of the drive, and I didn't either. The bracelet kept its warmth all the way home. Heavier than it had been this morning, still carrying whatever it had picked up in the parking lot. At the light before my block, I lifted my left hand off the wheel and turned it to look at the inside of my wrist. The skin around the bracelet was faintly pinker than the skin of my forearm, which I had not noticed earlier and which I was not sure had been true earlier. By the time I pulled into the space behind my building and cut the engine, the warmth had started to ease, not gone yet, but lessening. I sat in the car for a minute with Eddie beside me and the engine ticking as it cooled. Then I got out and went upstairs to my apartment, and Eddie came with me. And I closed the door behind us, and the day was done.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.